On a freezing January night in 2016, a passenger train cut through the snow-covered forests of western Russia. Inside one of its dimly lit compartments, a quiet man typed furiously on a laptop, oblivious to the eyes that had followed him for months. He went by the alias Nijar. To the outside world, he was just another traveler heading towards St. Petersburg. But behind encrypted networks and hidden servers, he was a Hamas cyber specialist, responsible for penetrating surveillance grids, tracking troop movements, and masking weapon shipments into Gaza. For Israel, he wasn't just a hacker. He was an invisible battlefield. His keystrokes could reroute drones, expose agents, or trigger chaos. And somewhere deep in Tel Aviv, analysts watched his coded signals like heartbeats, waiting for the moment to strike. That moment had finally arrived on this train. 3 plainclothes operatives sat scattered across the same carriage. They didn't speak to each other. They didn't look at him directly. Their instructions were clear. Neutralize him quietly, cleanly, without drawing Moscow's attention. Russia was not a battlefield one could afford to disturb. The rhythm of the train hid every sound. Wheels thundered over tracks like distant drums. Outside, the world was darkness and frost. Inside, tension was a wire pulled tight, silent, near breaking. Nizar adjusted his glasses, unaware that his final transmission had already been intercepted. His screen flickered. A message looped. His network access had collapsed. The invisible game was over. What followed in the next 17 minutes would never appear on the news. No official statement, no photograph, no claim of responsibility. Only whispers shared in intelligence halls from Gaza to Tel Aviv. And somewhere in the moving night, a life quietly disappeared. If you're someone who enjoys real stories of espionage, hidden operations, and the unseen conflicts shaping our world, then you're in the right place. These events aren't just headlines. They're the silent battles fought in shadows, on train tracks, in hotel corridors, and inside encrypted servers. Before we continue, take a moment, comment your city, so we know where our community is watching from. Like this video to help push it to more curious minds, and subscribe so you never miss the next hidden chapter of history. Your engagement helps uncover more stories the world rarely speaks about. But who was this man on the train? This silent figure whose fingertips could change the balance of power without ever touching a weapon. His real name was Mar al-Khatib, though he operated under layers of aliases in digital space, born in Gaza during an era of siege and scarcity. He did not pick up a rifle like many around him. Instead, he found power in something far more elusive: information. He studied coding in underground internet labs, learned encryption through online black forums, and eventually became a quiet architect of Hamas's cyber warfare division, a unit designed to counter Israel, not with rockets, but with algorithms. For Israel, Mar represented an evolving threat. No longer was conflict limited to borders or battlegrounds. War had moved into servers, networks, satellites, bank accounts, and control systems. A single keystroke could expose undercover units, reroute military convoys, or communications. But how did a man operating behind screens, far from front lines, become a target of a covert assassination across international borders? And why Russia, of all places, became his last transit route? To understand that night aboard the train, we must step back into the wider strategic web that shaped it. We must look at the race for dominance in digital warfare, the silent intelligence, conflict between Israel and Hamas, the role of Russia as a crossroads for exiled militants, hackers, and intelligence brokers. This was not just the story of a single man. It was the story of a new kind of battlefield. One where wars are fought without uniforms, borders, or warning shots. Where the deadliest weapon is information. 2. Understand why a hacker traveling through Russia became the center of a silent international hunt. We must look at the political landscape that shaped him. For decades, the conflict between Israel and Palestinian factions evolved, far beyond territorial claims. It became a struggle across media, diplomacy, and now the digital sphere. Every message sent, every communication intercepted, and every surveillance feed accessed carried strategic weight. By the early 2000s, Hamas had realized that traditional confrontation alone could not break deep surveillance barriers. Israel possessed one of the world's most advanced intelligence ecosystems. with satellites watching from orbit, drones, monitoring skies and signals units sweeping communications. To counter this, Hamas began cultivating a new class of operatives, individuals who understood encryption, data routing, identity masking, and cyber infiltration. These actors didn't stand in front of tanks. They worked behind screens, often thousands of miles away. At the same time, Israel's intelligence community was undergoing its own evolution. Mossad and military cyber units recognized that future conflicts would be shaped not just by firepower, but by access to information. The person who could see before the enemy moved would control the battlefield. And so digital surveillance, targeted infiltration, and cyber sabotage became central pillars of Israeli strategy. Russia entered this equation as a gray zone. During post-Soviet fragmentation, Moscow became a crossroads where ex-intelligence specialists, hackers for hire, Middle Eastern intermediaries, and political exiles coexisted in complex, often untraceable networks. Russia did not openly side with any one faction in the Palestinian-Israeli conflict, but it did maintain diplomatic channels with all sides, creating an environment where people like Mar al-Khatib could move quietly, meeting contacts under the radar of Western surveillance. For Hamas, Russia provided something rare, a space where advanced digital tools, encryption systems, and technical expertise were accessible without direct monitoring. Universities, tech incubators, and underground coding circles became fertile ground for training cyber operatives. Meanwhile, Israel monitored these developments from afar, aware that every new skill acquired could shift the strategic balance. The rise of cyber warfare changed the nature of threat itself. One skilled analyst could breach financial systems, lock communications of military units, disrupt drone feeds, or expose informants embedded for years. Suddenly, a single individual had influence traditionally held by entire military units, and this made operatives like high value targets. But cyber operations brought a new complication: jurisdiction. Traditional battlefields had clear borders. Digital warfare dissolved them. A cyber strike carried out in Gaza could originate from servers in Malaysia, relay through Brazil, and be monitored from Russia. Tracking a hacker became less about geography and more about digital movement, an invisible trail made of signal timing, server signatures, and alias patterns. Israel eventually detected Maher's digital footprint. The problem was not just what he had already done. It was what he was preparing to do next. He was developing an encrypted communication mesh capable of masking large-scale troop mobilization in Gaza, potentially preventing Israeli drones and satellites from detecting coordinated operations. If completed, this system could alter the balance of conflict on the ground, and so the cyber battlefield spilled into the physical world. Decisions were made in Tel Aviv behind closed doors. Names were listed, travel routes analyzed, surveillance quietly extended into Russia. Carefully, subtly, avoiding any move that could trigger diplomatic fallout. This was no longer just intelligence gathering. It was the quiet shaping of a hunt whose final act took place on a moving train in the Russian winter night. Inside a dim operations room in Tel Aviv, a handful of senior analysts sketched the problem in blunt terms. Maher al-Khatib had built capabilities that could blind Israeli reconnaissance and expose long-running assets. He was not a soldier on a battlefield, but an architect of concealment. Neutralizing that capability required more than an airstrike or a public indictment. It demanded precision, deniability, and the near-perfect removal of a digital node. The plan began as a debate about risk. Act and risk a diplomatic incident on Russian soil, or wait and accept a widening cyber threat. Who initiated the plan was less a single person than a convergence of units. Cyber analysts who traced traffic patterns to Russian exit nodes, human officers who provided fragmentary human reports, and a small operation cell that specialized in low-visibility actions abroad. The plan's champions argued that a surgical, minimal footprint intervention would do the strategic most good with the least political cost. Their superiors agreed. The mission would be surgical in concept, clandestine in execution, and deniable in public. The method was chosen for 3 reasons. First, Maher's pattern of life suggested mobility. He rarely stayed in one place for long and preferred civilian transit to avoid attention. A moving train provided a controlled enclosed environment where intervention could be localized without creating a wider scene. Second, striking in transit. Reduced the risk of collateral digital compromise. Removing him while he was between secure networks minimized the chance his systems would cascade data to co-conspirators. Third, a low-profile approach avoided. Overt engagement with Russian authorities. The objective was to act without forcing a public reckoning. Technical work ran parallel to physical preparations. Signals analysts mined metadata, timing packet routes, and node hops to predict windows when Mars remote connections would be weakest. Cyber teams developed contingency scripts to sever access logs and plant confusion in any network traces that might be analyzed later. Not to hack rail infrastructure or provide violent instructions, but to ensure attribution would remain murky. All communications inside the operation use strict compartmentalization, need-to-know channels, single-use burn, phones, and non-persistent digital footprints. No long messages, no unnecessary chatter, only short encrypted bursts with predetermined codes. Logistics required choreography. A team studied train schedules, carriage configurations, and typical passenger flows in the targeted corridor. Agents assumed cover identities matching plausible travelers and staged in nearby hotels, practicing routes, timing there. Walks to and from the station, and rehearsing simple non-violent coordination signals. Support elements. Secured short-term safe houses and medical contingency plans. Precautions against anything going unexpectedly wrong. Importantly, planners considered exfiltration routes that avoided official checkpoints and would not require formal consular contact, preserving deniability. Psychological and legal considerations were equally prominent. Leadership insisted on strict legal review within their own council to weigh consequences, even as lawyers were given only the facts necessary to evaluate risk. Ethical debates were intense in closed rooms. Was removing one man justified to protect thousands on the ground? Analysts countered with worst case forecasts of a successful encrypted mesh, enabling attacks and blockages of life-saving intelligence. The decision to proceed rested on this calculus of imminent harm versus political cost. To reduce operational friction, support was recruited from non-official channels where plausible. Local fixers, people who could book rooms, arrange discreet transport, and provide insight into regional patterns, were engaged with cash transactions and minimal paper trails. Surveillance teams practice benign behaviors for blending in, reading newspapers, sleeping, playing cards, no flamboyance, no heroics. Rehearsals emphasize silence, timing, and the smallest possible footprint in public spaces. Finally, tension mounted. In the hours before movement, the operation's inner circle met one last time to agree on abort criteria. If Russian security vectors changed, if Meyer boarded an unexpected train, or if civilian risk rose, the mission would be called off. Everyone signed confidentiality agreements that were ceremonial only. What mattered was the human cost of a leak. In the end, they chose the least visible path. Move like shadows, leave no official trace, and accept the moral weight of a choice made in secret to shape a public future. January 17th, 0212. The platform was a smear of dim fluorescent light and drifting breath. The carriage doors side closed as the train slid away from the station and the world reduced to glass, metal, and the soft hum of Versailles. Inside compartment 6, Maher, reading lines of code beneath. The pale glow of his laptop, didn't notice the new pattern of faces now punctuating the car. A tired businessman, a woman with a hardbound novel, 3 men with unremarkable backpacks. They were ordinary silhouettes in a long stream of ordinary travel, and that ordinariness was there. Shield. So too, 23. The team's internal clock marked small increments. Departure, first junction, the stretch of track where phone signals often dipped. They moved beneath the surface of normally. One operative placed a newspaper on his lap and flicked its pages with 2 practiced thumbs. Another pretended to sleep, head tilted against the window. Everything about them suggested boredom, not the strained concentration coiled behind their eyes. 0231. Mayer leaned forward as a new packet of data arrived. He typed a string of commands, slow, methodical, then paused, as if listening to the pulse of the network. A faint exhale left his lips. That breath, ordinary and human, registered across the carriage. It was the small, fragile moment when a life intersects with intent. 2:35, the trains. Rhythm masked nearly every sound. Metal on rail, the distant squeal at curves. The muffled announcements intruding with the wrong station names. The operatives used those textures as a cloak. A subtle, rehearsed exchange of glances passed between two of them. Not words, but signals. Time-stamped, practiced. Reversible. They had rehearsed contingencies, and rehearsals have a way of crystallizing into a rigid calm. 0238. An operative shifted, blocking an aisle camera with the angle of his shoulder. Another casually dropped a trivial object that demanded Maher's neighbor's attention. A momentary diversion. Nothing more than a human inconvenience. Mar glanced up, adjusting his glasses. He did not notice the object on the floor, nor the way the carriage's light briefly skimmed the faces around him. 0242. The crucial minutes arrived in compressed stillness. A small device, the size of a lighter buried in a pocket, was activated to isolate Maher's immediate connection to any persistent network. The effect was not violent. It was surgical and crucially untraceable by anyone not already inside the loop. Maher frowned, tapping at keys, trying to re-establish a dropped node. The screen blinked, a frozen ring of progress. He swore softly under his breath. The voice of a man who had always lost more than he admitted. So 245. One operative rose as if to leave. She approached Mir with an apology ready, an accidental brush of shoulders, the polite exchange over a dropped glove. In that small physical space, she slid a paper envelope into Mir's bag and straightened with an apologetic smile. The gesture read as kindness to any casual observer. To the team, it was the final quiet nudge that closed a loop. 0247. Maher pushed his laptop into sleep mode and slung his bag over his shoulder. He stood, tying his coat, the motion. Ordinary, the practiced gait of a man who traveled late and often. He began to move down the carriage toward the vestibule, aiming for the lavatory, a route that made sense and drew no attention. The operatives let him go, allowing the rhythm of the train to shepherd him toward the planned convergence. So 250. At the corridor's narrow choke point, two operatives converged, one blocking, one guiding. There was no shout, no gunfire, no dramatic struggle. Instead, there was a rapid, controlled exchange, a hand on an elbow, a whisper that could be mistaken for a request for directions, a maneuver that steered Ma away from the exit and into a compartment where privacy was immediate. The language used was the language of constraint disguised as courtesy. 4253. In the enclosed space, the team created a small bubble of silence around him. They spoke in clipped phrases, giving no public clues. Maher, disoriented by sudden shadow and the loss of his connection, argued at first, his voice pitched to reason rather than alarm. The operatives replied with rehearsed calm, offering assurances that sounded plausible. Confusion about the schedule, an unplanned stop, helpful hands. He relaxed, as many do when confronted with reasonable kindness. 256. The carriage windows showed a blur of night, trees, the occasional orange smear of a highway lamp. None of the movement suggested urgency. Yet inside that small space, time compressed into a handful of decisive seconds. The operatives executed the final sequences of their plan. Careful, non-lethal methods intended to incapacitate rather than maim, and to ensure the target could not immediately return to his devices. The emphasis throughout was on minimizing collateral attention and avoiding anything that would force the train to stop or attract outside forces. 0259. The team created the impression of a minor medical emergency. A pulse taken, a bandage returned, a whisper of calm. Mar's eyes, wide with confusion, slid shut for a moment as a medic gesture reassured him. In those seconds, the operatives ensured the most important objective, that Mar would not walk away with the systems he had been building, nor would he trigger an alert that could send his network into emergency lockdown. 4303. With the carriage still moving and the lights passing in steady lines, the operatives moved like shadows again, quietly, efficiently, leaving behind a tableau of ordinary travel. Maher lay slumped against the seat, respirations shallow, but even pillows and a cotras. Concerned face turned the scene into a domestic vignette, more than a crime scene. The team exited at separate stops. Down the line, washed into the anonymity of other passengers disembarking into different cities. 0310. Outside, the world kept its indifferent pace. Vendors, snow, station clocks. Inside, something vital had been taken from a man who had once believed information would be his safeguard. In Tel Aviv, the operations monitors recorded the expected changes. Systems that had been poised to go dark sputtered instead into confusion. The decision-makers breathed a private breath. The immediate objective achieved, the threat materially reduced. There was no press release, no official lament. The mission's success would be measured not in headlines, but in what did not happen. The avoided blackout of surveillance, the thwarted cascade of compromised assets, the lives that continued under protection because a hidden node had been removed. And yet success arrived braided with consequence, a ripple that would touch diplomats, intelligence officers, and the family of a man who had spent his life hiding in code. The immediate task concluded, but the story had spun was far from over. By dawn, an odd assortment of local and international chatter began to ripple through back channels and message groups. In Tel Aviv, the operations controllers watched quiet telemetry changes and exchanged confirmations. The node was gone. The mesh had not completed. Relief was tight and clinical. An operational win that translated immediately into fewer blind spots over sensitive units. Inside military command rooms, analysts updated watch lists and reallocated surveillance resources to cover gaps the disappearance might create. In Gaza, the reaction was different and more chaotic. Rumors spread quickly through encrypted networks and tea house corridors. A man had vanished on a train. A hacker had been taken. Without official confirmation, competing narratives proliferated, some insisting it was an arrest by foreign agents, others blaming internal security forces for a purge. Families demanded answers of local leaders, who in turn issued statements of concern while promising investigations that would likely run into walls of international deniability. Russia maintained radio silence in public channels. Official spokespeople described the incident as a routine passenger medical emergency until pressed. Their messaging carefully avoided accusations. Intelligence communities in Moscow privately whispered about the growing presence of foreign operatives and the delicate calculus of responding in a country that prized control of its own narrative. For Russian authorities, acknowledging covert actions on their soil would invite uncomfortable scrutiny. Denying anything publicly preserved diplomatic flexibility. In international diplomatic circles, calls were made and notes were passed. Embassies queried railway authorities, and consulates sought passenger manifests. Quiet cables referenced anomalous activity and requested discretion. Nations with vested interests in Middle Eastern stability watched closely, recognizing that the removal of a single cyber actor could alter immediate operational plans and could, if mishandled, inflame regional tensions. Media outlets constrained by sparse, verifiable facts filled gaps with speculation. Headlines varied by nation. Some framed the event as an intelligence success, others as a troubling extraterritorial operation. Social media amplified every whisper, screenshots, leaked snippets from forums, and personal testimonies claiming to know the man. Conspiracy theories proliferated alongside professional analysis, each amplifying the sense that something significant and secretive had occurred within Hamas and allied networks. The loss triggered urgent internal audits. Technical teams combed code bases and server logs for signs of backdoors or betrayals. Human intelligence units revisited safe stream practices and travel advisories for operatives in transit. A directive circulated to limit long distanciance transits through hostile or ambiguous territories. Trust already brittle hardened into suspicion. Arrests and interrogations followed in some cells as leadership sought causes. Was this a betrayal, a surveillance compromise, or simply bad luck for families nearest to the event? The aftermath was intimate and human. Loved ones sought explanations and the comfort of ritual, while mourners and supporters debated the morality of the act in private conversations that mixed grief with defiance. In quiet rooms, parents, siblings, and colleagues tried to reconcile the man they knew with the shadowy roles he played, questioning whether a life spent in secrecy justified the methods used against him. Politically, the incident sharpened Existing fault lines. Allies of Israel praised the neutralization of a potent cyber threat in private channels, while critics warned of precedent that covert operations abroad, even when tactically successful, risked diplomatic fallout and cycles of retaliation. Whatever the immediate tactical benefits, the episode reintroduced old debates about sovereignty, the rules of engagement in cyberspace, and the ethics of statecraft in a digitized age. In the quiet that followed, two truths became clear. The immediate cyber threat had been blunted, and the political echo would reverberate far longer than anyone anticipated. But as days passed, the story began to fracture. It did not settle into a single accepted version. Instead, it splintered into parallel narratives, each shaped by ideology, denial, pride, or fear. The official silence from all states involved created a vacuum. And in geopolitics, a vacuum is never empty. It fills with stories. One narrative held that Mar al-Khatib was not targeted for elimination but for capture. In this version, the operation aimed to extract him alive, so his knowledge of encryption systems, safe communication channels, and server routes could be harvested. Those who supported this account pointed to the controlled nature of the operation. No public violence, no dramatic incident, no sudden disappearance of the train from schedule. If true, it meant Mar was not gone, only hidden, interrogated in a place where questions could be asked without record. Another version insisted the Russian security services were aware or even silently complicit. This version gained traction in circles who believed that Russia saw value in maintaining relationships with all major actors in the Middle East, but also recognized the need to balance its internal stability. In this narrative, Russia allowed the operation to proceed because it removed a destabilizing presence without forcing Moscow to publicly take sides. The absence of outrage, inquiries, or diplomatic outbursts became in this telling the quiet signature of an understanding. A third narrative contradicted both. It argued the opposite, that the operation was a massive breach of Russian sovereignty carried out under the radar, and that Russian authorities were caught off guard. Those who supported this view pointed to subtle changes in security protocol on major railway lines afterward, more patrols, tighter surveillance, increased scrutiny of foreign travelers. If true, this version implied a silent anger beneath official calm, a resentment stored for later leverage. Within Palestinian circles, divided interpretations emerged as well. Some claimed Maher fell not because of foreign intelligence, but due to internal betrayal, a rival faction, a jealous competitor, or a leak from a circle he trusted. In movements built on secrecy and compartmentalization, suspicion often turns inward fastest. This narrative painted the event not as an external strike, but as an internal fracture. One more quiet rupture in a region where loyalties are complicated and power is rarely stable. Others within the same networks refused to believe any version that suggested vulnerability. They presented Maher as a martyr taken by overwhelming force, a symbol of resilience. In this telling, the event became myth. A story to be told in coded songs whispered in safe houses written into digital graffiti across encrypted platforms. Whether the details were accurate mattered less than the emotional truth that their struggle produced individuals who shaped the battlefield in unseen ways. Meanwhile, intelligence analysts and academic theorists looked at the case from another perspective entirely. For them, this event raised larger questions. What constitutes sovereignty in a world where war exists in data streams? Where are the borders of a battlefield that stretches across cables, satellites, and server farms? What rules apply when a programmer becomes more strategically dangerous than a tank commander? If a hacker can change the course of conflict without ever stepping foot on traditional soil, then the old laws of war, territory, uniforms, clear fronts begin to dissolve. The truth of what happened on that train may never be fully known. Each narrative contains fragments. Each faction insists on a version that strengthens its worldview. In the end, the story became a mirror. People saw in it what they needed to believe. The impact of the operation was not felt in a single moment. It unfolded quietly, first in technical networks, then in military planning rooms, and finally in the political realm. The removal of Mar al-Khatib did not stop the conflict. It shifted its balance. The immediate tactical outcome was subtle but significant. Without Mar's encryption, Mesh under completion, certain covert movements could no longer be concealed. This allowed Israeli surveillance units to retain visibility over strategic corridors that might otherwise have been obscured. On a battlefield where seconds of early warning could prevent ambushes or rocket volleys, visibility equaled survival. In this sense, the operation delivered measurable security value. However, loss of a single operator did not eliminate the program. Hamas still retained fragments of code, partially trained cyber recruits, and the conceptual outline of the system. But Meyer had been the organizing intelligence of the initiative, the one capable of integrating pieces into a seamless whole. Without him, the project slowed from coordinated progression to fragmented experiments. Progress continued, but with hesitation, mistrust, and lack of shared confidence. A project built on secrecy struggled to reorganize under suspicion. Meanwhile, Israel's intelligence community gained more than just the removal of a threat. They gained insight into how deep Hamas had embedded cyber operations into its long-term strategic planning. This shifted how analysts modeled future conflict. No longer could cyber capabilities be considered support tools. They had become core military assets on par with tunnel networks or drone manufacturing. The operation confirmed a trend intelligence officers had theorized but not yet proven. The battlefield of the future would not be defined solely by rockets or soldiers, but by code, encryption, and data movement. In diplomatic terms, the operation added a quiet layer of tension to relations among the actors present. Russia, while not publicly reacting, likely took careful note of the intrusion. Even if Moscow tolerated the act or ignored it for strategic convenience, it demonstrated that outside intelligence services were willing to act with autonomy in its territory. That reality carries implications. In the world of diplomacy, memories are long and silence does not mean forgiveness. It often means storage. For Hamas, the strategic consequence was psychological as much as operational. The certainty that cyber units could operate across borders, perceived as untouchable because of digital distance, shattered. Trust became a scarce resource. Recruitment slowed. Senior figures began questioning travel routes, communication methods, and the safety of foreign study and training. The paranoia that followed was not chaotic. It was structured, quiet, and inward. Every movement became second-guessed. For Israel, the operation reinforced a doctrine that had been evolving for years. Prevent capabilities before they mature. Neutralize threats early before they transform from theoretical danger to active force multiplier. This reflected a shift from reactive security to proactive shaping of the conflict. Environment executed in silence rather than spectacle. But there was a deeper impact, one measured not in tactics or territory, but in principle. This operation blurred the boundary between digital combatant and civilian traveler. It raised long-term questions about the nature of modern warfare. If a keyboard can be a weapon, then who counts as a combatant? If war is fought across borders of code, then where does the battlefield end? Strategically, the operation was a success. It protected assets, delayed adversarial development, and reinforced deterrence. But strategically successful decisions carry long shadows. The conflict moved more deeply into realms where accountability is difficult to trace, where battles occur without declaration, and where the consequences unfold slowly, invisibly, over years rather than hours. The train continued moving. The world continued turning, and yet the balance had shifted quietly, decisively, and without applause. In the years that followed, the story of what happened on that cold Russian train compartment did not fade. It transformed. It became part of the unspoken lore of modern intelligence work, referenced not in official documents, but in whispered case studies, private briefings, and the quiet lessons shared between operatives. Inside Israeli intelligence circles, the operation was studied as an example of precision in the cyber era. A mission shaped not by force, but by timing, access, and the ability to move invisibly in civilian environments. It influenced how future cyber targets would be profiled, not by physical threat, but by systemic leverage. Maher's work became a template to recognize others like him, individuals whose influence came not from command hierarchy, but from code architecture. Within Palestinian movements, the event produced a dual legacy. One narrative cast Maher as a martyr of the digital battlefield, a pioneer in the belief that resistance had to evolve into data and encryption. Stories about him circulated in internal speeches, encrypted forums, and quiet commemorations. The second narrative was more uncomfortable. It warned of the vulnerability of hypers, specialized individuals. When knowledge is concentrated in one mind, the loss of that mind becomes strategic collapse. This led to shifts in training methods, skill diffusion, redundancy, collective knowledge building. In academic and policy discussions, the incident became part of a broader debate about the ethics of targeted elimination in cyberspace. Traditional laws of war were built for physical combatants. But what happens when a keyboard can redirect drone paths, reveal undercover units, or disable defense networks? The line between civilian and combatant blurred further. Some argued that states had the right to neutralize such threats before harm occurred. Others warned that this logic could justify endless unregulated conflict. Controversy also surrounded the method and location of the operation. Conducting an action in a major sovereign state without acknowledgement challenged the norms of territorial respect. Some saw it as a dangerous precedent. If one nation could quietly act abroad, others might follow. This contributed to quiet diplomatic strain characterized not by public accusations, but by increased caution, watchfulness, and memory stored for future negotiation leverage. The event also influenced intelligence doctrine.